This is Photographing the West podcast, the podcast for people who love to explore the western highways and byways while photographing the landscape and wildlife. And now here's your host, Kirby Flanagan.
Hello, and welcome to episode number 61 of the Photographing the West podcast, brought to you by Photo Tees. Today I have with me photographer, author, and educator Marc Silber. Marc has a new book out called Create, which discusses how to foster creativity in yourself and your life. So we're going to talk about that today. Welcome back, Marc.
Good to be here, Kirby. Thanks for having me back.
Yeah, my pleasure. So creativity is hard to talk about and write about. What made you decide to write about it?
Boy, that's a good question. I think I've been, fascinated with creativity most of my adult life. And as a photographer, what are we doing but trying to create something that others hopefully will resonate with? But I decided at some point to take on the bigger subject of creativity because I found that a lot of people, just kind of in an informal survey kind of situation, I found a lot of people felt like their life lacked creativity. And I thought, wouldn't it be interesting to kind of unpack this subject and try to find some answers? So, Kirby, that's really why I decided to write the book. It's been kicking around in my mind for a while, and I finally just said, okay, I'm going to tackle it.
Well, I'm glad you did. I enjoyed reading the book and learned a lot from it. So hopefully others will as well.
Yeah.
So talk about the creative cycle that you describe in your book and how that all works.
Yeah, in my book, Advancing Your Photography, I took apart the cycle of photography, and I'd been puzzling over that for a long time. And it was interesting because in the process of doing all these interviews I've done with so many different photographers, I found there were common things that they went through. And then when I was trying to figure out if creativity itself, just the subject of creativity, follows the same pattern, and it turns out it does. Briefly, you have the cycle of creativity starts with your visualization. Ansel Adams said that the whole key to a photograph is your ability to visualize it. Here he was, a couple of stories. He was driving on his way to the Ahwahnee. I've heard it told differently. He might have been going to happy hour, and he might have been going to rehearse the annual Christmas play that they did. But he's driving along. All of a sudden, he sees the moon over Half Dome. He's got his Hasselblad in the car, in his Cadillac. He pulls over. He visualizes how he wants this thing to look and gets the shot, back in the car, goes to happy hour. That's an example of a visualization in a photograph, but you can use visualization for any kind of creative activity. How you want to design your house, or how you're going to bring more creativity to your family and your kids. So visualization is the center of that. Then you have to know how to use your tools, whatever those are. If you're a writer, there's tools of writing. If you're a photographer, obviously, and we'll be talking about that, I think, more specifically, you got to know your lens and your camera and all these other tools. Then once you've got your vision, you got your tools, then you've got to work your craft. You got to get out there and put it to work. And there's no shortcut for that. You got to just work. And writing a book turns out is a job like any other job. You got to get up in the morning and set some targets and say, I'm not going to end off until I've written 1,000 words or 1,500, or if you're really energetic, you might go for 2,500 or 5,000, as some of these really prolific authors have done. But if you're photographing, you got to get out and photograph. Then we hit the stage of editing. And no matter what kind of creative activity, we always hit an editing stage where you stand back from whatever it is, and tweak it and dial it in the way you want it to look or feel, whatever, or sound. In the case of video editing, I mean, that's really an integral part of production of filmmaking, is the editing process. Then you hit the final stage is sharing it. You got to get your work out to the world. And sharing doesn't just mean giving it out for free like on Instagram or Facebook. It means really putting it into the hands of somebody else. And hopefully you're going to sell it. I think there's nothing more satisfying than selling your work, because that's kind of the biggest, we can get excited about a thumbs up or a like, but the biggest like you can get is somebody buying your work and appreciating it. So in brief, that's the cycle of creativity.
And as you say, the visualization is kind of the core of your approach, and the approach that Ansel took when he talked about pre-visualization, I think.
Yep.
So how can people improve their ability to visualize? That's not an easy thing to do.
Kirby, the easiest thing you can do is to look at whatever art form inspires you, and it doesn't have to be a direct link. Bob Holmes, who I've done a lot of videos with, very popular on my YouTube channel, is inspired by modern painting. Now, whatever works for you, each of us has a point of inspiration, but I recommend going to museums. I recommend finding forms of art that kind of gets your visualization muscles being exercised. You can look at books. It's preferable to go look at art on the wall, or in the case of sculpture or even architecture, something that will start to resonate for you. And it's interesting because it's not even that you take that piece of art and you say, well, I'm going to try to photograph just like that, but you're going to find something in it that helps you to visualize that work. There's something about it that causes your mind to kind of latch on to some piece of it. Like, for instance, Joey L., who's also an amazing photographer, really looked at the work of the masters like Rembrandt and Caravaggio and found the way they lit the backgrounds was how he wanted his photographs to look. So you look at his photographs, you can see that resemblance, and even in his framing. So the easiest way to expand your visualization is really to look at art, and that can be in the form of a film too. That can be music. That can be, as I said, going to museums, which is always a great point to kind of fill your inspiration up.
What worked for me, I think, as much as anything, although I've spent a lot of time in museums over the years, is going to workshops, learning from other photographers how they interpret a scene and visualize a scene. And of course, that's something you do as well as with workshops. Are you going to do workshops with the Create book?
I am, for sure. We created an online course for advancing your photography, and I'm going to do the same thing for Create, and I'm definitely going to be doing some workshops that deal with, okay, here's some examples of finding creativity. Because you look at great artists, they're just pulling inspiration from everywhere. Picasso said you have to be able to just find it and run with it. And I have an example of Picasso eating, this is in the book, a photo essay by an amazing photographer that you probably have heard of, David Duncan Douglas, war photographer, but he also became a friend of Picasso's, and he photographed him over a 25-year period. And one of these sequences, Picasso's sitting at a table eating fish, and he pulls out the bone, he debones the fish, he looks at the bones, and you can see this spark going off in his mind. He finishes his meal, he goes into his pottery studio, cuts a sort of a semblance of the fish flesh, and then presses the fishbone into it and makes it basically a plate with the fishbone on it, or the fish flesh on it, minus the fishbone. And he holds it up at the end, and you see this wonderful creation by Picasso. Something inspired him. Most of us would just think, how do we get this fishbone out of here without smelling up the whole house? And here's Picasso turning it into a work of art. So yeah, workshops are also a fantastic way to kind of juice up your inspiration and get to see things from another's viewpoint, which is really what it all boils down to.
Right. One of the other points you made in your book was becoming self-aware. That's not easy either, as you know. What are your thoughts about achieving self-awareness as it relates to photography or creativity in general?
I think it boils down to you have to have the ability to kind of look at where you're going. One of the things I talk about in the book is you have to have a purpose for what you're doing. And that has a lot to do with self-awareness. Like, why am I going out right now to take this photograph? What is it I want this photograph to communicate to others? And there's a sense of understanding that can come along with that. I think self-awareness also comes about by trying to get some feedback from others as well. Oddly enough, sometimes the easier way to go is, rather than looking at it just endlessly yourself, is pass that photograph or whatever you're creating along to someone else and see how they perceive it. So for example, in the writing of this book, when I finished it, I sent it out to a lot of beta readers, which means people who get to read the book in advance of it being published, to get their feedback. And by their feedback, it gave me an awareness, and this is a way that I increased my own awareness of myself or my writing. I could see how they perceived it. In many cases, I had to make changes to make it more understandable. So that's one little trick to improving your own, awareness of your own work, is try to get feedback from others, see how it resonates or it doesn't resonate. At the end of the day, you're going to make up your own mind whether you want to make any changes or not, but at least you'll have perceived it from their viewpoint as well.
Yeah, that's great advice. Kind of hard to do for most of us, because you either get, likes, or you get pretty intense.
Superficial.
Yeah, both superficial, and the other extreme is you get, the trolls who
Oh boy,
hate everything, and so trying to find somebody in the middle that gives you feedback that's useful is difficult to do, from my experience anyway.
Yeah, what I suggest is find a few. It doesn't require a lot of people, but find a few trusted people that you would appreciate their feedback. They're not going to be trollish, and they're not going to just give you a super saccharine, feedback either. And that just comes from kind of developing a few people that you really trust and have them look at it. My mom was my first kind of critic when I was growing up as a photographer. She'd look at a photograph, and she was very blunt with me. She'd say, I had this one photograph, which is in the book, of a kid throwing a plane. And she first saw it and thought it kind of looked like he was throwing it in the wrong direction. So she'd just ask me questions, and a lot of times that brought about a different awareness for myself. And that's actually mentioned by David Campbell, who's this multi-Grammy award-winning composer and producer. His son is Beck. You may or may not be familiar with his work, but he's pretty popular. And he said that he fostered that creativity when Beck was pretty young, just by asking questions. And sometimes that's all it takes, is a question, and then you sort of sit back and look at it. And by answering that question yourself, you usually come to a higher point of awareness.
Yeah, that's great to have that from a parent. Can't say I had that experience, but I can understand how it would work
Yeah,
well.
exactly.
So, another impediment to creativity that we all seem to have to some degree or other is that negative inner voice that tells you, what you're doing is not worthwhile, or you don't know what you're talking about, or whatever. What are your ideas for limiting this negativity?
Well, aside from just kind of general advice like taking good care of yourself and making sure that you're strong physically and mentally through different, like for instance, one of the things I recommend is going out and taking walks. As simple as that seems, that can quiet that negativity because it gets you out of your head and looking at the environment. As a matter of fact, there was a study done at Stanford in 2014 that found that walking just by itself can increase creativity by 60%. Now, that's a pretty simple remedy, but Kirby, I pretty much go out on a good long walk every single day. It's interesting. It's hard to carry that negativity around in your head when you're out looking at something. So that's one really simple tip. The other thing is we all have to learn to ignore it. Every one of these, I interviewed 11 different creatives in different fields. Every one of them pretty much brought up this idea that you have to overcome that negative thinking. It bangs you right in the face, anywhere from imposter syndrome that was mentioned to just, why am I doing this? What's this all about? Especially when you're involved in a project that has a lot of parts to it. So staying on track with your own purpose for doing it is super important. And also watch out for the trolls because they can be hidden under any number of rocks. And those are the worst because it can go right into your own head and you start thinking those negative thoughts coming from somewhere else. But my easiest recommendation is take a walk every single day. It'll improve creativity and it'll help dampen out that negativity.
Yeah, in reading your book, I didn't realize you were such an outdoorsman with all the mountain climbing and everything else that you did.
Yep, I sort of grew up in the mountains. As a matter of fact, I was a mountaineering instructor. And up in your neck of the woods, the first overnight hike I took by myself, I was 13 at Desolation Valley. And, my parents were kind of brave enough to let me go off on these treks by myself. The next summer, let's see, 13, no, I was 15. I took an 8-day hike in Yosemite all by myself. So, I kind of grew up, appreciating the mountains and learning the value of these really long trips. And of course, I'd always carry my camera with me. So I came back with a bunch of rolls of film that I would dive into the darkroom and have to develop and print. So that kept me pretty busy through the summers.
Yeah, sounds like it. Well, that's a great way to grow up, I have to say. I envy you for that. So another point you made in your book was about passion, and several of the people you interviewed mentioned that as being important. My personal point of view is that it's certainly a necessity for creativity, but not sufficient in and of itself. It's more of a starting place. Would you agree or not?
Yeah, I think the thing about passion is it really does transmit to others. You can hear it in a singer when, that artist has, you can hear it, my wife likes to watch American Idol, and you hear renditions of songs that we're all familiar with. And sometimes what's really missing is the passion. They might be singing it perfectly, but there's that quality that just isn't there compared to the original artist. I think passion is sometimes something that you have to instill in yourself and keep reinstilling. And Kirby, it's funny that a lot of these things kind of link together. You know, the negativity we were talking about is something you have to overcome to keep your passion going. And you have to remind yourself why you're doing it and what you're hoping to achieve. Even for you, you know, you have to obviously have a passion for what you're doing to have. What episode is this? Was it 63
61.
or 5? 61. That's a lot of episodes. So, you know, you obviously have that passion. I appreciate that. So each of us has to find in ourselves, what is it that you're trying to achieve, and how can you kind of keep that fired up as you go? Because we're going to run into obstacles. They're there. It's not like, you know, the world is perfect at all. As a matter of fact, it seems like in the area of creativity and artistry, we can open ourselves up to even more barriers. So the thing to do is just to keep reinstilling the sense of purpose, and hopefully the joy that you get back from it will keep you fired up. I mean, that's ultimately what I found. And in talking to these other creatives, that's what they experienced, was no matter what major obstacles that many of these people had to overcome, they found joy at the end of the day, which kept them going.
Changing directions a little bit, you discussed the importance of knowing your tools for photographers. That's cameras and lenses, of course.
Yeah.
What advice do you have for photographers about knowing their tools and learning to see them as tools as opposed to seeing them as the latest and greatest technology?
Yeah, that's a good point. I think too many times we get razzle-dazzled by the latest, you know, release and so forth. Kirby, I kind of miss those days when cameras just lasted forever. You know, I have sitting over here on my shelf, I've got a Hasselblad, a Rolleiflex, and a Leica. None of these cameras will ever go out of date. There's no new devices that need to be plugged into them or that they need new features. But the world we live in now with digital, you know, obviously things are going to keep advancing. But what essentially you need to know is how to work your camera so it doesn't get in the way of the photograph. That's something that Bob Holmes made a big point about. If your camera starts to become an impediment to your catching whatever it is that you saw, then you need to study it and learn to do it almost instinctively. And his recommendation is learn to think and see like a camera. Because let's face it, you're not going to see what your eyes see. Our eyes capture way more detail and much more latitude than what comes through a camera. So you need to know, what is that camera going to capture? Whichever model you have, you should really take enough photographs and look at it on a screen so you can see what the end result is going to be. And there's really no shortcut for just learning your equipment inside and out, so that when you see or visualize the photograph, bang, you can go right into action and get it. I mean, I've lost photographs because I was fumbling or, you know, taking too long or whatever. Ansel Adams' famous story about the moon rise over Hernandez, New Mexico. He's coming along at the end of the day. Wasn't a particularly good day as far as photography was concerned for him. And there's that moon and the tombstone kind of glowing. He couldn't find his light meter, and he had to do a whole mental exercise to determine the number of candle feet per square inch, and chose his aperture accordingly. I mean, it's amazing. He did this sort of mental gymnastics really quickly. And, you know, he came back, the negative was a little bit thin, but he was able to get the print that he wanted. And that's because he knew his equipment so well that he could, even without the light meter, he could still, you know, set his exposure correctly. So my advice is get to know your equipment so well you don't have to think about it. simply said, but it does take some work.
Yeah, I think that's excellent advice, and it seems to be one of those things that photographers, I suppose at any level, but especially people that are beginning or even intermediate, have difficulty with, because, teaching workshops myself, I talk to people and they don't understand their equipment nearly as well as they should to get the results that they want. And that's a hard lesson to learn, I guess.
It is. And I think it's a work in progress that we all have to just make sure to, keep up that practice. If you think about it, what does an athlete do? They're just constantly practicing. Same thing with musicians. And as photographers, we can't really ignore the fact that we've got to practice with our tools. And just to correct myself, it's not candle feet per square inch, it's feet. And fortunately, I never have to use that computation. I do use light meters, and I've never had to do the mental workout myself.
Yeah, me either. Well, talking about Ansel and that particular photo, I guess it has a reputation of, at least, of being highly edited in the darkroom, and that the original wasn't nearly as dramatic.
Yeah.
And Ansel, I think, was one of those people that enjoy editing. Personally, it's not my favorite thing to do, although I know people for whom it is. But what's your advice on that area?
I do enjoy editing. I like the process, and I did enjoy. I should be back in the darkroom someday, but I did enjoy the whole process in the darkroom. I would say the best advice I could give you is just remember that it is part and parcel of the whole process. So whether we're editing written work or a photograph, or you're going to probably do some kind of audio editing here, I mean, it's just part of the finalization of that piece of creativity. And I guess just my only advice would be to embrace it as part of the whole cycle of creativity.
Yeah, I do my best to do that. Some days it works better than others.
I hear you. I understand. I know it's not always necessarily the most favorite thing, but I find, in writing, I think it's very interesting, and I recommend this in the book, is just get your words out there. Remember to distinguish between working your craft and editing. And I think sometimes people try to mix them together so that they're editing while they're writing or while they're photographing. And it's actually better to just go out and try to capture all the photographs you need, or write, just let it flow. And then as a separate phase, then put on your hat as an editor and basically differentiate what you need to now clean up. And that actually allows the flow to really go as it should, rather than being stopped by trying to edit midstream.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I find myself that I'll take pictures, and when I look at them initially in the back of the camera, I really like what I did, and then I look at them a day or two later and I don't like them at all. So I wait 4 or 5 days and then go back and look at them and decide, well, maybe they weren't so bad after all.
Isn't that funny how that works? I know, it's pretty interesting. Boy, it's, remember back in the day, you didn't really get a chance to look at your stuff until whenever it was you got back in the darkroom and developed it. And then your first look at it was just a contact print. So if it was a 35 millimeter contact print, it's a pretty tiny little deal there. And it's funny how you can miss, and I talk about this in my book, you can miss really great photographs that way, because you don't have them enlarged and you can't really see what it was that you captured. I've actually had people go through my eye contact prints and pull out photos that they really liked that I had completely passed over. That's happened to me on a number of occasions. So one of the aspects of editing, and this is a different kind of editing, is having someone else help you pull your work together. That's not so much editing in the sense of changing, what you're doing in Photoshop, but it's more when you're compiling your work, get another set of eyes in there to look at them because they may find something that you missed, and that's actually pretty important. That was brought up to me by Annie Leibovitz, actually. She mentioned that. Try to get somebody else to help you edit. Even if it's a friend that you trust, they might look at something and see something that you missed, and that's quite important.
Yeah, even in the digital darkroom, I occasionally go back and look at things I did years ago, and most of the time I say, what was I thinking? But every once in a while I find something that's a gem that I didn't even bother to do anything with. So
that's nice, isn't it?
Yeah. So part of your book is interviews with people who were extraordinary in a variety of ways in their own fields. Does your approach to creativity work for the average person with a 9-to-5 job who doesn't have creativity as part of their lives 24/7, as you say?
Yeah, Kirby, and that was kind of one of my main reasons for writing the book is I found that too many people I talked to who I considered creative told me that they didn't think they were creative people. We all are creative in some area. But two things. First of all, let me point out that the people I interviewed were just regular old 9-to-5 people at some point, and they had the passion or the desire to break out of that. In fact, a lot of the stories talk about how they were able to do that and the things they had to overcome to get there. Sometimes racking up their credit cards because, whatever they wanted to create cost some money, and they had to really trust that their passion would pay off in the end. So they're regular people like the rest of us. They just happen to rise above a lot of the barriers that some of us run into that keep us from doing it. But one of the reasons why I decided to write this book was to help people who wanted to put creativity into their life with a kind of a roadmap. Because I think it's, there's all too much talk of just being inspired and finding your passion and do what you love. And, those are really nice words, but if it doesn't really help you, it's kind of like telling somebody, this is what I learned in mountaineering school. You can say, hey, look, you got to climb to the top of that mountain. But if you don't know how to do it, you're not going to get there. It's a daunting task climbing a big mountain. And you need to have a set of tools, and you need to know how to plan, and you need to know how to use your equipment, and you need to be able to read a map. And there's all these skills involved. And if you don't have those things, you're either not going to make it to the top, or you're going to, even worse, get injured or, lost or whatever. And having been on rescue missions, it always boils down to the fact that somebody wasn't prepared. They didn't really know what they were getting into. They wore the wrong equipment, wrong clothing, didn't pack enough food, et cetera, et cetera. So what I was trying to do with this book was give people a roadmap for creativity and a set of skills and tools that they could use to, first of all, find that area of creativity or passion that they have, and then what to do with it once they found it. So one of the biggest hurdles in the 9-to-5 kind of mindset is that you don't have enough time. So I tackled that with one of the chapters of how to kind of do a time budget. We think of budgeting our finances. We're going to go on a trip, or we're going to buy a new piece of equipment, or whatever. We budget it out. But what about budgeting your time? What about budgeting your week? So you end up with enough time every week to follow your passion. And I actually give people a little exercise. And by the way, I should mention, at the end of every chapter, I ask questions that I think will stimulate people to really take a good look. That's part of that whole self-awareness process. And then I give them practical steps, because I don't want this book to be just a book of theory and nice ideas. I want it to actually create change in a person's life. And the only way to make that change occur is by doing stuff. So I give people a series of action steps that they can follow to bring about the change that's needed to get into that more creative mode in their life. And one of them, in the case of the 9-to-5er, would be, okay, let's find your creative time. Let's find the place where you're going to do your creativity, set up some kind of little studio, and start to hang out a shingle as a creative person so that other people recognize it as well. Those are just a few little tips that people can run with to bring about a more creative life.
Yeah, I have to say that that's what I enjoyed about the book, is often creativity is talked about in pretty vague terms, whereas in your book you've outlined specific things to do to foster creativity. So I think that's should be a big help to a lot of people.
Thanks, and I really look forward to seeing that feedback, because I do want to hear back from people as they're going through this. So I give a couple of ways they can stay in touch with me.
Good. One of the things you talked about earlier was getting your work out, and in some ways that's easier now with social media, but getting it out in a studio setting or as a recognized piece of art seems to be no less difficult than it has been for years and years.
Yeah. There's a few things I recommend on an easy basis. Make sure you know, as photographers, don't just keep everything in your computer. Get your best work, make prints, get them framed, put them up on the wall. I mean, I think we all too often leave some of our stuff lying around in hard drives when they need to be out in the rest of the world, so the rest of the world can see them. Another thing, my wife really loves to make these books. You know, she'll take, there's a lot of different platforms for that. And she'll have me help, you know, compile the photos and then turn them into books we've done that for our kids. We've done that for trips. That's another way to share your work on an easy basis. And then, of course, putting together a good website. Like I really like SmugMug. I know those guys are a great team. They have great customer service. Have a good representation of your work, along with social media, of course. And then, you know, get into exhibits. There's lots of opportunities to exhibit your work in small or large ways. Those are just a few. I mentioned them in the book, just different tips for getting your work out there, which is really satisfying.
Well, before we go, tell everybody where they can find you, your latest book and your previous books and everything you do.
Well, the best place to look for me is go to my website, and that's Silber, S-I-L-B as in boy, studios with an S, silberstudios.com. And from there, you'll see links to my YouTube channel, to social media. You can also find my books. They're going to be available pretty much everywhere, Barnes & Noble, and obviously on Amazon. And you can search by my name. It's probably the easiest way to find them, Marc, M-A-R-C, S-I-L-B-E-R. But if you go to the website, one of the cool things that I will add to the book is a set of resources. And I've done that for the previous books. So as you're reading through the book, you'll see mentions of various websites and books and authors and whatnot. You can go to the resource page and you'll find links right there. So you don't have to do the heavy lifting. We've already figured all that stuff out for you. We want to make it a kind of a multi-visual and reading and being able to find those resources as easily as possible. But just remember, Marc Silber, you should be able to find me that way.
So when is your new book going to be actually available?
It's going to be hitting the stores July 23rd, which happens to be my next birthday.
Okay. Nice birthday present to yourself, huh?
It is, exactly. I chose that. We actually moved it out a little bit for a couple of different reasons. But I thought, well, it's close to my birthday. Let's just have it drop on July 23rd, which is a Tuesday. And it's a good day to release a book.
There you go.
So the book is available now for pre-order on Amazon, and you'll get a pre-order bonus. If you go to my website, you'll be able to download a quick start guide once you've ordered the book.
Good to know, and thanks for letting everybody know that, Mark.
You bet, Kirby.
Well, it's been a pleasure to have you back on, Mark. Thanks to all our listeners for tuning in. For more information about Mark and his book, go to www.flanaganphotos, spelled Photos.com, for the show notes. Bye for now, and we'll talk again soon.
Thank you, Kirby.
Thank you, sir.
Thanks for listening to Photographing the West podcast. Please subscribe to the podcast in iTunes and leave us a review. Till next time, here's wishing you safe travels and good light.